The film opens not with explosions, but with silence. A haunting, heavy silence that feels almost sacred. A gray dawn lingers over the Normandy coast. The camera glides slowly across the desolate beach. Waves hissing against jagged shards of metal, the skeletal remains of landing craft jutting from the surf like rusted tombstones. The wind moans through them, carrying echoes of the dead. Seagulls circle above, their cries distant, ghostly, the only sound that breaks the void. Then, a faint movement. A figure drags himself across the sand. A medic. His uniform torn, his arm bleeding, his face streaked with salt and ash. Blood clings to the wet sand behind him like a trail of memory. His helmet bears the Red Cross, a target and a shield all at once. He crawls past the bodies of the men he tried to save. Some lie face down in the tide. Others stare blankly into the gray sky, frozen mid-prayer, mid-breath. His hands tremble, not from fear, but exhaustion. He's been working without pause, without hope of relief. He carried no weapon, only faith and a will to save, not destroy. This is the story of Waverly B. Woodson, Jr., a 21-year-old Army medic from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African-American combat unit to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Cut to archival footage, black soldiers training on English fields, lifting barrage balloons into stormy skies, smiling through fatigue. Their presence, long omitted from history books, now fills the screen with quiet defiance. The film shifts back to Omaha. The first waves of landing craft grind against the beach, their ramps slamming down into a storm of bullets. Men spill out, stumbling, falling, vanishing into surf-stained crimson. In the chaos, Woodson's landing craft is hit. Shrapnel tears through his leg and back. He should have died there, in that instant, but he doesn't. He pulls himself from the wreckage, bleeding, and starts to treat the wounded before he could even stand. As the invasion unfolds, we see the world through his eyes. A soldier, clutching his stomach, whispering for his mother. Another screaming for morphine. The beach littered with torn packs, burning vehicles, broken bodies. The air rattles with machine gun fire and the thunder of German artillery. And in the middle of it all, one young medic refusing to stop. He's not firing back. He's not seeking shelter. He's performing surgery under fire, using the edge of his helmet as a surgical tray, tearing bandages from his own uniform, patching arteries with trembling hands. When the tide surges in, he drags the wounded out of the water, lays them in rows, and moves on to the next. Hour after hour, his world narrows to one act, saving life. Between scenes, the documentary breathes. Slow-motion footage of waves rolling over helmets. Letters home, read in voiceover. "We're ready, Mama. We're going to do our duty." Then, back to the chaos, the sheer inhuman will that drives him forward. Woodson works 30 hours straight. He is cut, burned, half-conscious, but he stays. At one point, he revives a man whose heart has stopped. At another, he amputates a leg with nothing but a field knife and grit. And still, he refuses evacuation. By nightfall, he has treated more than 200 men. And yet, when the guns finally go quiet and the beach belongs once more to the living, his name fades into obscurity. No medal, no parade, no place in the official record. The visuals fade to black and white footage of post-war celebrations, white soldiers being honored, generals shaking hands. He saved hundreds. He carried no weapon, so why was his story nearly erased? A slow dissolve, the sound of the surf again, the silence returns. We rewind to the 1940s American South, a world defined by contradictions. Dusty roads stretch through small segregated towns where whites-only signs hang like silent guards at every diner, school, and movie theater. The radio crackles with swing music and news of Europe's war, while Jim Crow laws continue to draw invisible but brutal lines across American life. On one side, young white men line up proudly to enlist. On the other, black citizens navigate a daily maze of humiliation and exclusion. Among them is Charles Drew Woodson, Jr., a quiet, ambitious biology student from Pennsylvania. His hands are steady, his mind sharp, and his dream simple yet radical for its time, to become a doctor. He studies late into the night, reading about the miracles of surgery and the new frontiers of medical science. But every door he knocks on closes with the same quiet finality. We're not hiring colored doctors. The message is clear. No matter how skilled, how driven, or how patriotic, his color defines his ceiling. Then comes December 7th, 1941. The world tilts on its axis. Radio announcers shout, "Pearl Harbor has been attacked." Across America, the air hums with outrage and unity, and for a brief, fleeting moment, even the boundaries of race seem to blur. Like thousands of others, Woodson enlists, driven by the belief that maybe, just maybe, fighting for democracy abroad might earn equality at home. But the military he enters is a mirror of the nation's divisions. He's assigned to a segregated training camp, where black and white soldiers drill on separate fields, eat in separate mess halls, and sleep in different barracks. The white officers, most barely older than the men they command, carry the weight of prejudice in their tone, subtle to some, crushing to others. Black troops are often given brooms instead of rifles, told to prove themselves before being trusted with a gun. Woodson is trained not as a combat soldier, but as a medic, the man expected to save lives on the battlefield, even though he's not considered equal to those he's saving. It's a bitter irony that defines his generation. He studies anatomy, first aid, and the gruesome details of battlefield triage. His weapon is not a rifle, but a medical kit. His courage will be tested not by how many enemies he kills, but by how many lives he can pull back from the brink. Patriotism versus prejudice, valor versus invisibility. Through rare archival photos and expert interviews, the documentary brings to life a world that America often tried to forget. The camera pans across separate training grounds, white recruits practicing live fire drills while black medics patch up dummies in silence. Overhead, planes thunder past, symbols of the war drawing nearer. Then comes June 1944. The men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion prepare to depart for Europe. The air is thick with uncertainty and salt from the English Channel. They load their gear, their medical packs, their fears. The sea churns with steel, landing craft lined up like rows of destiny. The camera follows Woodson as he steps aboard, helmet low, kit strapped tight. Around him, some men joke nervously, others stare into the gray horizon. This moment, the calm before the storm, carries a heavy stillness. For a heartbeat, time slows. The documentary captures Woodson glancing down at his hands, the same hands that once held textbooks and beakers, now trembling slightly against the hum of the ship's engines. These are the hands that will soon be drenched in the blood of strangers and friends alike. And then, in a voice heavy with both fate and foreshadowing, the narrator whispers the line that defines the entire chapter. They told him he wasn't fit to fight, but fate would make him the man every soldier needed. As the waves rise and the sky darkens, the screen fades to black, setting the stage for one of the most overlooked acts of heroism in the history of World War II. June 6, 1944. The sky over Normandy burns with chaos. The dawn that was supposed to bring liberation arrives shrouded in thunder, not from weather, but from war. Streaks of orange tracer fire cut through the mist. Bombers drone above the gray waters, their engines echoing like an unending heartbeat of destruction. Smoke rolls over the churning waves as landing crafts fight their way toward the shore. As the first waves of troops hit Omaha Beach, confusion and carnage consume everything. Machine gun nests open fire from the bluffs, mowing down men before they can even raise their rifles. The air is thick with sand, metal, and fear. Bodies float in the tide, tangled in barbed wire. Orders are shouted, lost and swallowed by the roar of artillery. Among these men is Waverly B. Woodson, Jr., a young medic of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, a black soldier trained to save lives in a world that often denied his own dignity. His landing craft bucks violently against the waves, packed with men praying under their breath. Then, without warning, a deafening crack, the craft hits a mine. A white-hot explosion tears through the hull. Shrapnel rips into Woodson's leg and back. The blast throws him to the deck. He collapses, bleeding, gasping for air, the metallic scent of his own blood mixing with salt and smoke. Around him men cry out, some silent forever. Any other man might have waited for help, but Woodson refuses. Gritting his teeth, he bandages his wounds as best he can, drags himself through the cold surf, and crawls onto the sand under relentless fire. Bullets whip overhead, kicking up fountains of sand inches from his face. The tide pulls at him like it wants to drag him back to sea, but he pushes forward, inch by inch. He reaches a patch of wreckage and transforms it into a makeshift first aid station. No shelter, no safety, just duty. Crawling from one man to the next, he begins treating the wounded. His hands tremble, but his focus is absolute. He bandages shattered limbs, stops arterial bleeds, splints broken bones. He performs amputations with trembling precision, using nothing but a scalpel, courage, and sheer willpower. The sound design here is relentless, the whine of incoming shells, the gut punch of explosions, the rasping breath of the dying. Between bursts of machine gun fire, you can hear his voice, calm, steady, commanding, telling soldiers to hold on, to stay with him. Radios crackle with static, medics call for morphine, and somewhere distant church bells toll beneath the thunder of war. The camera follows him from ground level, crawling, sliding, dragging himself through mud and blood. His uniform darkens until it's almost black, soaked through not just with his own blood, but that of the men he refuses to abandon. Around him, the beach becomes a living nightmare. Yet in the middle of it, his presence feels like defiance itself. Hours pass, then more. He keeps working. 30 straight hours. He pulls survivors from the surf, resuscitates drowning men using improvised CPR, and bandages wounds until his hands go numb. He moves like a machine powered by mercy alone. When supplies run out, he improvises with rags, belts, and torn uniforms. Every soldier he saves becomes a flicker of light against the darkness around him. Voiceovers from survivors and historians cut in. He never stopped. You could see the pain in his face, but he wouldn't let go of his duty. We thought we were done for. Then he crawled up out of the surf, bleeding, limping, and started saving lives. Archival footage fades between cinematic slow motion, trembling hands wrapping bandages, blood mingling with seawater, the faint rise and fall of a chest newly filled with air. Black and white realism captures the grit, golden-toned slow motion captures the humanity. Emotionally, this sequence forms the film's beating heart, the purest image of courage not in the taking of life, but in the saving of it. Every cut, every heartbeat, every cry for medic becomes a note in a symphony of endurance. As night falls, he finally collapses beside the men he saved, his body giving out before his will does. He has treated more than 200 soldiers, most of them strangers, all of them alive, because one man refused to stop. His blood-stained hands tell the story of D-Day, not from the perspective of those who fired the bullets, but from the one who bore witness to every wound. And as the camera slowly pulls back, the narration delivers the line that defines him and this film. He had no weapon, yet he fought the longest day and won. The camera lingers on the shoreline of Omaha Beach, waves rolling over blood-stained sand. The chaos has ended, but the quiet feels heavier than the explosions ever did. Amid the ruins of battle, John A. Woodson, the medic who worked through enemy fire, who saved hundreds of men with trembling, exhausted hands, fades back into the ranks, unheralded. His tent becomes a shadow among thousands, his name another line in an overlooked roster. The men he saved remember him, whispering about the doctor who never stopped. But no reporters come, no official citations follow. His story, like so many others, is lost in the noise of victory parades that have no room for men of his color. Newsreels showed generals pinning ribbons, parades rolling down New York's Fifth Avenue, and white soldiers celebrated as living symbols of courage. The public loves its heroes, but only certain ones. In segregated America, the triumphs of black servicemen rarely fit the national narrative. When Woodson's unit returns, there are no brass bands waiting, no journalists eager to hear their accounts of heroism under fire. Letters are written, recommendations sent, but somewhere between the battlefield and the War Department, the recognition vanishes. His wife waits for word that never comes. He too was brave, but history records his name while Woodson's remains in the margins. It is not the fault of one man, but of a system built on hierarchy and exclusion. The officer's medal gleams in photographs, while the black medic's service is footnoted or forgotten. The juxtaposition is cruelly poetic. One man's valor becomes legend, the other's becomes silence. Woodson is recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, possibly even the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork goes missing. This is not an accident, historians later conclude. Files were misplaced, citations downgraded, and recommendations buried under layers of bureaucratic neglect, sometimes deliberate, sometimes indifferent. In post-war interviews, military clerks recall stacks of award forms for black soldiers that never left the desk. The system, built to honor heroism, had no room for heroes that challenged the myth of white-only valor. The phrase "goes missing" becomes a haunting refrain, an administrative euphemism for injustice. Through archival footage and voiceover, the film slows down, shifting from Woodson's personal story to the collective. It traces patterns of erasure stretching across the Army, Navy, and Air Corps. Narration reveals how military segregation didn't end with the war's battles, but extended into the pages of history books. Each missing file, each downgraded award, becomes evidence of an invisible war fought after the guns went silent. Using historical documents, interviews with military historians, and declassified archives, the film exposes how racial bias shaped military recognition. Experts describe letters unearthed from the National Archives, where officers questioned the appropriateness of giving the nation's highest honors to black men. Historians hold up faded typewritten pages that tell a quiet tragedy, not of defeat, but of denial. Archival records reveal deliberate patterns, acts of heroism described in vivid detail, but ending with the same phrase, recommendation, not approved. The viewer feels the weight of each decision, the cold bureaucracy that erased sacrifice. The film shows ceremonies from the 1990s and 2000s, medals finally pinned to aging veterans or handed to descendants who never met the men they honor. Families weep as long-delayed justice arrives too late. These moments, while redemptive, underscore the depth of the original wound. The camera pans over gravestones, medals gleaming under sunlight, as the narrator reminds us, recognition delayed is recognition denied. The score swells, low strings and mournful brass, as the narration deepens. The audience has witnessed courage, sacrifice, and moral clarity, only to see it erased by prejudice. This betrayal doesn't just belong to Woodson. It belongs to an entire generation who fought for freedoms they were denied at home. The tone becomes elegiac, grief and anger interwoven. Tuskegee Airmen doubted, Black Marines mocked, the 688th Postal Battalion called unfit for duty. Clips and photos appear in montage. Pilots in crimson jackets walking past segregated airfields, Marines standing tall despite slurs, women of the 688th sorting endless mail with quiet defiance. The narration threads their stories together, forming a tapestry of perseverance. Each faced a different battle, yet all shared the same enemy, a nation reluctant to see them as equals. Yet these soldiers kept serving, proving themselves not for medals, but for the idea of America that didn't yet exist for them. The camera returns to the battlefield, not as a place of death, but of defiant hope. Woodson's gloved hands, the Tuskegee plane soaring, the 688's letters reaching home, these become symbols of faith in an unrealized promise. They fought for an America that excluded them, believing that someday it would live up to its creed. That quiet heroism, service without recognition, becomes the moral heartbeat of the story. The visuals intercut between 1940s newspapers ignoring Woodson and modern scholars piecing his story together. Headlines flash, Allied medics save hundreds, but no mention of his name. Then in modern light, historians speak to the camera, surrounded by stacks of yellowed documents. Each word they recover feels like an act of resurrection. The film moves between eras, black and white denial and color correction, showing how truth, though buried, still fights to surface. Faces stare back at the viewer, young, proud, and long forgotten. The audio fades to the faint echo of waves on Normandy's shore, bringing the story full circle. Silence becomes its own statement, a memorial to what was lost not in battle, but in memory. He saved hundreds, but couldn't save his story from being buried. The line lands like a verdict. On screen, his portrait finally appears, name restored, citation displayed. For a moment, justice feels possible. The narrator pauses, then adds softly, "Now at last, we remember." Decades later, historians begin to uncover the lost records of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, a small, nearly forgotten unit buried deep in the archives of American military history. Dust-covered boxes, mislabeled files, and fading carbon copies begin to tell a story that had almost vanished. Among them, one name begins to reappear, again and again, as if whispering from the past. Waverly B. Woodson, Jr. For years his courage had lived only in fragments, in footnotes, in memories of aging comrades, in the quiet pride of a family who never stopped believing his story mattered. But now, as historians sift through declassified documents, faded field reports, and eyewitness testimonies, the pieces begin to align. They find medical logs describing an African-American medic who treated the wounded for hours under fire on D-Day, saving dozens of lives while bleeding himself. They find letters from soldiers who remembered the medic who never stopped. And they realize this wasn't just a rumor or an anecdote, it was real. Eyewitness reports describe Woodson's courage in haunting detail, how he dragged men from the surf while artillery shells exploded around him, how he refused evacuation even after being hit, and how, as chaos reigned on Omaha Beach, he set up a small medical station behind the dunes and kept working until he collapsed. Each account forces the U.S. Army and the nation to re-examine its own history. How could such heroism have been forgotten? Why was his nomination for the Medal of Honor quietly set aside? The emotional tone here is hope intertwined with grief, a bittersweet unraveling of truth that had waited too long. The film slows down to show the passage of time, the turning of brittle pages, the hum of a microfilm reader, the quiet reverence of scholars piecing together a man's erased legacy. Viewers watch archival researchers flipping through dusty files, the flicker of overhead lights illuminating faces filled with awe and disbelief. Veterans, their voices trembling with age, recall the medic who never stopped. One pauses mid-sentence, his eyes wet, as he says softly, "He saved my life." Interviews with Woodson's widow and family add a deeply human layer to the unfolding revelation. His wife, now elderly but poised, speaks with quiet pride. She describes the man she loved, not just a hero, but a husband who carried the weight of both war and prejudice with quiet dignity. Her words carry both warmth and sorrow, pride in what he did, grief that recognition never came while he was alive. Their children and grandchildren sit beside her, surrounded by old photographs and yellowed letters, reflecting on the legacy of a man they knew only through stories that now, finally, the world is beginning to hear. Visually, the sequence is cinematic and deeply atmospheric. Faded photographs dissolve into reenactments, lit by shafts of sunlight piercing through dust-filled air. Close-ups of trembling hands turning over medals, of typewritten pages stamped confidential. Archival reels flicker across the screen, soldiers in Normandy, the chaos of Omaha Beach, the blur of motion and smoke. In contrast, modern-day shots show historians at work, cross-referencing files, highlighting lines in old memos, connecting one name, one date, one act of bravery after another. Every discovery feels monumental, like breathing life into a ghost. As the tension builds, the story shifts from remembrance to reckoning. Modern campaigns emerge, led by historians, veterans groups, and members of Congress, pushing to award Woodson the Medal of Honor he was denied. Petitions circulate. Senate resolutions are introduced. News segments revisit his story, sparking debate about race, recognition, and the unfinished work of honoring black soldiers who gave everything for a country that seldom acknowledged them. The camera lingers on the contrast. Black and white footage of a young medic tending to the wounded dissolves into color footage of modern-day advocates standing on the steps of the Capitol. The line between past and present blurs. The film's tone swells with emotional gravity, underscored by strings that carry both sorrow and resilience. And then, as the narration draws toward its close, we return to the beach, waves washing over silent sand where his story began. The narrator's voice softens, almost as if speaking directly to him. The bullet stopped long ago, but the fight for his name goes on. Those words echo over the image of a single medal, one that has yet to be pinned, resting beside a faded photograph of Waverly B. Woodson, Jr. The light catches on the frame, and for the first time in decades, it feels as though the world is finally listening. Not just on Woodson, but on what his story means. What defines a hero? Is it the number of enemies killed, or the number of lives saved?
That question lingers long after the gunfire fades, stretching beyond medals, beyond history books, beyond the narrow margins of official recognition. Because what Woodson's story ultimately asks us is not how a man fights, but why he chooses to heal. These were men who returned home to a nation they had saved, yet one that refused to see them. Woodson's courage becomes a symbol not only of battlefield valor, but of human dignity, of the quiet, defiant insistence that compassion, too, is an act of heroism. It is here that the narrative breathes, expanding from the chaos of 1944 Normandy into the silence of modern day. The camera glides across the same beaches, now calm and radiant in the light of morning. Where tanks once roared and men cried out for help, there are now children laughing, couples walking hand in hand, wildflowers bending in the ocean breeze. The sand that once ran red now holds footsteps of peace. Visually, it's as if the past and present exist in the same frame. Ghosts of soldiers walking beside tourists, their echoes softened by time. The sound design deepens the symbolism. Distant thunder rolls like artillery, but gradually blends into the rhythmic hush of waves. Each crash of the surf carries the faint echo of D-Day's chaos, the shouts, the prayers, the stretcher calls, until finally they dissolve into stillness. The roar of history fades into the whisper of remembrance. It's not just a transition of scenes, but of emotion, from pain to peace, from war to memory, from sacrifice to gratitude. Emotionally, this moment lands like a breath held too long finally released. The tone is solemn, reverent, yet quietly uplifting. The viewer doesn't leave with adrenaline or vengeance, but with understanding, a sense that true closure comes not from victory, but from empathy. That the truest legacy of war is not who conquered, but who cared. Then comes the line, simple, timeless, devastatingly true. He went to war without a gun and proved that the greatest weapon is the human heart. As the music swells, soft strings, perhaps the low hum of a choir, the screen fades to sepia. The credits begin to roll over a black-and-white photograph of Waverly Woodson, standing in uniform, calm-eyed, resolute. His name appears beneath the image, and for the first time, it feels complete. His story no longer lost to history, but carved into it. The waves continue to roll across the sands of Normandy, washing over his image like a benediction, as if the sea itself is paying tribute. And in that quiet final frame, sunlight over the water, the sound of gulls, and the distant laughter of families, we understand the full circle. The war that once divided the world now unites it in memory. Woodson's legacy becomes not just a chapter of history, but a reminder that healing too can change the course of war, that compassion is not weakness, but strength, and that sometimes the bravest men are those who fight not to take life, but to save it.